Act of Worship, your source for commentary and discussion on worship, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Well, hello and welcome to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Thank you for joining me today. It is a pleasure to be with you discussing all things worship. That is worship history, theology, culture, trends, any of that kind of stuff, and also discussing theological topics and ideas and cultural topics and ideas. I've been really talking about worship-related topics recently, and that is what we will talk about today. And in fact, I have some ideas for some upcoming episodes where I will be focusing on worship. That is my area. That is what I studied. That is what I have done in practice for a long time. And so I firmly believe, not just because that is my area, but that worship is of utmost importance. In fact, I would say priority. If you have a local church that has different areas of focus, say evangelism, missions, education, even whatever the case may be, often worship is put on the back burner, but it needs to be primary rather than secondary, because everything stems from worship. And I spend my time in teaching and in ministering, discussing with people and hopefully changing their perspective to where worship becomes more primary. It is not a secondary issue. It is primary. Missions exists because worship does not exist. Evangelism exists because worship does not exist. Worship is primary. And today what I want to talk about is the preeminence of the Son, and specifically in Christian worship, the preeminence of the Son. Worship is trinitarian. You've probably heard me discuss that before. Worship is trinitarian, but it is also christocentric. And so you may question and ask, how can both be true? How can it be trinitarian and yet also christocentric? But considering Christ's complete work in the Christian life, an acknowledgement of the christocentricity of Christian worship becomes apparent. And perhaps subconsciously, a lot of people consider God solely as the Father. And often we verbalize this without even realizing it. Someone will start a prayer and start the prayer with Jesus. And there is nothing wrong with praying to Jesus. Prayer is Trinitarian. But then later in the same prayer, we'll say Father. There are two different distinct beings there, the Son and the Father. And perhaps without even realizing it, people do that and don't even realize the co-equal nature of the Son. But Paul argues for Christ's preeminence in his letter to the Colossians. And as worshipers of the living God, the preeminence of Christ is vital to God-honoring worship. Listen to this from Colossians 1:15 through 20. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. There's a lot there. I could unpack that for a long time. I'm not going to spend a ton of time discussing the nuances of that passage, but what I want to focus on is the preeminence of the Son. And here, the preeminence of the Son is clear and should be considered in such a manner that Christian worship teaches and reveals the preeminence of Christ. And so with that mentioned, there are four constraints that I think need to guide how Christian worship is employed in regards to the preeminence of the Son. The first is that the Son is eternal. The Son is eternal. Paul's letter to the Colossians offers clarity on who Jesus is. Certainly Jesus is God incarnate, but the humanity of Jesus should never overshadow the deity of Jesus. It's a dual nature. He is God. In other words, the Son was present and involved in creation order because he created everything himself. But the Apostle Paul contends that all things were created by Jesus. So yes, we focus on the humanity of Jesus. Absolutely. He is human, but he is also divine. In Colossians 1:16, Paul says all things were created through him and for him. I was once asked if Jesus is eternal. I think I've mentioned this before, even recently. And after thinking for a short amount of time, I responded by saying that the Son is eternal, but since Jesus did not enter reality until the incarnation, his human form did not exist prior. Now hear me, okay? Don't think this is a heretical teaching. The Son has always existed, but Jesus, God incarnate in the human flesh, did not come into play until his birth. That is part of the miracle of Christmas, the incarnation. God became human. This is a manifold doctrine, but the concept that Jesus is God and therefore created everything is difficult for many people to grasp. That is one thing that people outside the Christian faith have a difficult time understanding. How could God become human? And that's why so many other faiths teach that Jesus was a regular man, or maybe not a regular man, but an extraordinary man, but not God. But Jesus taught as much. He is God. And so from henceforth, after the incarnation, Jesus is eternal. The Son is already eternal, has no beginning, has no end. So Jesus now is eternal because the Son is eternal. But the Son is co-eternal with the Father and the Spirit because he has always existed as God. So Jesus then is preeminent because he is the incarnate version of the Son, and so he is eternal. So the Son is eternal and therefore preeminent. The second point here is that the Son is provident. The Son is provident. Jesus' preeminence is evident in his providence. Paul argues that the Son holds all things together in verse 17. In him, all things hold together. And this statement really stalwartly reiterates Paul's argument that the Son existed before all of creation in verse 16. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created for him and through him. So Paul's argument that the Son existed before all creation, that there's never been a beginning for the Son, he reiterates that in verse 17. Jesus was not created. Okay, the Son was not created. Jesus, even in his incarnate version, was not created. The Son simply became flesh. And so there has never been a time, as Arius would have argued, that Jesus did not exist. That's kind of one of the heretical teachings of Arius. And you remember the story of St. Nicholas, when Arius said there was a time when the Son was not. And the story goes, it's probably true, that St. Nicholas slapped Arius across the face and was thrown in jail for a day. But St. Nicholas was teaching the correct theology. Arius was not. Arius said that there was a time when the Son did not exist, and he was created later. But providence should be considered differently than it's commonly discussed. Okay, we know God is able and capable of doing anything he wants. The question is, will he? So Christians tend to speak of God's providence in terms of his provision and catering perhaps to human desires, as if God could not be provident if circumstances don't fit human expectations and comfort. So for example, God is considered provident when he heals someone or provides financial needs. But God is provident irrespective of these actions. God is provident when someone dies, even though someone has prayed for healing. God is provident when bills are late, even though someone prays for financial provision. And certainly God is provident when human expectations are not met. In fact, it is selfish and wrong to blame God when situations go awry, as if humanity deserves God to respond to us according to our expectations because we jerked his chain. How dare God not meet my expectations? Listen to me. We don't deserve anything from God, and if he had never done anything for us, he would still be holy, he would still be righteous, he would still even be loving. But God is provident. That is who he is. So God's providence is evident in our bad situations and our good situations. And Christians would be wise to remember the words of Paul in suggesting that all things are held together by Jesus Christ. Furthermore, such truth like this should comfort us, because no matter how dire the situation is, Jesus controls everything. And we can rest in the assurance of this truth and worship God boldly because of it. The third imperative here is that all things proceed from the Son. We are talking about the preeminence of Christ. And because Jesus is God, created everything, and all things are held together by him, all things proceed from him. So the question is not whether Jesus created and controls all things, but his purpose in doing so. And so in Christian theology, perhaps the most basic and fundamental truth is that of God's glory. In other words, everything exists and was created for God's glory. I had a seminary professor that wisely stated, the glory of God is always the issue. And it is. It's not my happiness. It's not my well-being. It is always the glory of God. And so believers should find joy in the fact that everything that occurs in life occurs to glorify God. When trials are present, it's not meaningless. Something is happening. In other words, difficulties are not meaningless, but they hold a purpose in the overarching purpose of God's glory. So Paul says that all things are through Jesus and for him. In fact, Paul argues elsewhere in Romans 11:36 that all things are from God, to God, and through God. Everything then proceeds from the Son and by his allowance. So Christ is first before all creation, as he says in verse 18, and God himself created everything and allows all things to exist. So all things then proceed from God the Son and center around his work. Christian worship is christocentric because everything centers around Jesus. And in this manner, the Son is preeminent and should be worshipped in a way that the centrality of Christ is exceedingly evident. Yes, it is Trinitarian, but it is also Christocentric. And then the final imperative I have is that Christian worship centers around the Son. I've already mentioned this, but everything in the Christian life centers around the Son. Certainly worship is Trinitarian, but the Son is the center even of gospel work, because if the Son subsists as the mediator between God and humankind and between all gospel-oriented activity, then he is the center. Christ is preeminent. And when God's people gather to worship, all activity is employed to the glory of the Father through the Son and in the power of the Spirit. Do you see who the middleman is there, who the mediator is? It is to the glory of the Father through the Son in the power of the Spirit. So worship is Trinitarian and also Christocentric. And Paul directs the reader's attention in this passage to the certainty and preeminence of the Son. Christians' worship should be pointed to Christ's accomplished work and his continued providence. And so without the preeminence of Christ, all human endeavors are futile. But it is Christ who makes it possible for believers to worship God boldly and without hindrance. The only reason we can approach the throne of God in worship is because we are doing it through Jesus Christ. He is central. So Paul presents the case for the preeminence of Christ here in Colossians 1. And we, as Christian worshipers, can now experience it in corporate worship And in our own personal lives, everything centers around the Son because he is preeminent. So my hope and prayer is that as we worship God together, corporately, individually, that the preeminence of Christ would resound in our lives, that would be the focus. Everything we do would center around Christ and his work because he is the mediator and he is preeminent. I hope this has been helpful to you, that this has been something that has been eye-opening and life-changing. That's always my hope and prayer, that something, that God uses what I say, the messages that I teach, that God uses these words to change your life and to become a better worshiper of the living God. So thank you for listening today to the Active Worship Podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.